pick up any kind of voice in the room. And so things that you might not wish to be public could easily be heard by a number of people. So we'll ask that you be careful about that. But thank you so much for coming tonight. We're going to start tonight with a guest speaker, and David Stearn is going to speak to us, who has done lots of work in astrophotography and astro-imaging, and that's what his presentation is going to focus on tonight.
Okay, you want me to just go ahead and share my screen and start? Okay, can everybody hear me okay?
We can hear you in the room.
Okay, excellent, great. Okay, so my topic is my deep sky astrophotography journey. I apologize for the word journey in the title for a presentation. It seems like everybody has a journey of some sort, but I didn't know how to title it. Little background on the presentation. It was originally set up for my camera club that I still belong to, which is located in Naperville, Illinois. And when I started to get into the hobby about a year and almost 2 years ago, I was showing some of the pictures I was taking to my club members through our Facebook group, and I was getting tons of questions about, well, what equipment do you use and what photograph was that all about? And I figured, maybe I should just put together a presentation for them. So the bulk of this presentation was put together for them, but I figured I haven't seen a lot of presentations for the TAA monthly meetings, at least on astrophotography. So I figure there must be a lot of those members, whether they're brand new members or existing members, that do visual now and perhaps want to know more about what it takes to get into the actual photography end of it. So what I'm going to do is show you how I started from knowing absolutely nothing about the hobby, other than knowing photography, and then where I am today. And I'm by no means an expert in astrophotography, nor I am an expert in processing. But I think if I share my experience, those of you who are possibly interested in exploring imaging, the imaging side of the house, this could hopefully be helpful to you. So a little about me. I'm from Illinois originally. I'm an Illinois native, and I've been an amateur photographer for about 20 years. My wife and I both decided when we were both retired that we were tired of the freezing Illinois weather and decided to migrate out to Arizona. And we now live in a Del Webb in Vail, Arizona. Love the weather out here. It's fantastic. In December of 2022, when I first started to get into the hobby, I became a member of the TAAA, and I'm also a member of the AI SIG group, and I'll tell you a little bit about that later on towards the end of the presentation. And a couple of things I want to bring up front. Prior to moving out to Arizona, I had no experience in astronomy, no experience in astro-imaging. I came into this hobby fairly cold in terms of starting it out. Also, the majority of the images you'll be seeing as we go through the slides are my own images, which I took from my backyard, which is a Bortle 4 area. I have not been to the CAC Center yet to image, but I hope to do it either later this year or early next year. So when I look at photography, I like photographing landscapes and close-ups of flowers, macro photography, as well as nature photography. And I've been doing it for a while. And I look at astrophotography in the same way. I look at the fact that it captures the beauty of our planet in terms of landscape photography. That's traditional landscape photography. But astrophotography reveals the stunning landscapes of the cosmos. So when I am looking at the sky at night, looking out at space, I picture it mainly as a very large, infinite set of landscapes that I can photograph. And this particular image was an image that I took. I would have had to go to New Zealand and shoot with about 6,000 feet elevation to get this shot. This was a shot that I processed from data from Telescope Live. But this is the style of imaging I like to do. I like colors. I like broadband images as well. But when I'm shooting emission nebulas, I'm typically looking to bring out the colors and the details of the images. So what is deep sky astrophotography? It's basically a specialized branch of photography that involves photographing objects beyond our solar system, such as stars. Sorry, I have a call here. I have to mute it. Stars, solar systems, clusters, nebula, dust, and galaxies. So why deep sky astrophotography? Well, for one thing, you can explore the wonders of the universe from your backyard. I just think it's amazing that you can capture the images you can capture through a modest telescope rig right from your backyard patio. If you're looking for something that has to do with continuous adult learning, this is the hobby for you because you'll never stop learning, whether it's imaging or whether it's processing. There's always something new. And it's an artistic outlook as well, because you can awaken, there's actually a photography phase that I learned years ago when I started the hobby, awaken the artist within. And everybody has an artistic flair, and this is just one way that I like to express my artistry is through deep sky astrophotography. I also found as I got into the hobby that there's a global community that you become part of. Not everybody does this. This is very specialized. It takes an investment, it takes time and effort, and you really have to be patient about it. But the thing that I like about it is I have friends all throughout the world that I exchange ideas, whether it's on Facebook or through Zoom. I have a good relationship with some of the developers who develop scripts and processes for PixInsight. So you get to meet a lot of people and you get to learn a lot. And most importantly, it's a fun hobby. I totally enjoy it. I'm always looking forward to the next time I go to get out and an image. So how did I get started in this hobby? Well, when we moved to Arizona, one of the things we noticed was that you could actually see the night sky. You could actually see the stars. You could see the Milky Way if it was dark enough, although not as dark as, say, a Bortle 1, but you could definitely see the night sky. I could even make out where Mars was and had a good idea where Jupiter could be. So, with very little knowledge, I kind of figured out where things were at. And we would have guests over from Illinois, and they'd be admiring the night sky. And I was always kind of joking about, oh, maybe one day we'll get a telescope, and the next time you come over, we can look through the telescope and see what's out there. But I really wasn't serious about it. I just kind of mentioned it in passing. So one day, my wife decided to surprise me and said, hey, instead of buying gifts for each other this year, why don't we buy a telescope? And I'm thinking it wasn't really in the plans for me to do so. I thought that if we buy a telescope, we'll use it a few times, and then it'll sit in the closet and we'll never use it again. But little did she know, or did I know at the time, that when she made that statement, she had released the Astro Kraken. And now it's a never-ending thing for me in terms of a hobby, in terms of investment, and how I occupy my time. And in case you're wondering, this is an AI-generated Kraken. I believe it's the Clash of the Titans version, and all I did was I went into Meta and said, create an image of a Kraken doing astro-imaging in a backyard patio of a Dell Web, and this is basically what it came out with. So what I did to start my research was I started to look at websites regarding astro gear. There was a lot of information I gleaned from YouTube. Astrobin.com, I discovered that site as well. I'm actually a member of it, and I have my gallery on Astrobin. That's a great resource if you're starting to look at camera gear, telescopes, if you want to see what types of images you can acquire and process. You could just do searches on specific objects and the particular telescope and the camera, and you can get a good sense of the types of things that you can create. So it's a great resource. And then Facebook has multiple Facebook groups by product, by manufacturer. There's a Pixin site user groups. There's all sorts of user groups out there that you can join to gain knowledge. I also visited Star Arizona as I was doing my search, and they were extremely helpful. And I talked to Scott and Dean, and I got a good feel for what my options were. I explained what I was trying to accomplish, or at least considering, and they gave me a couple configurations I could look at to decide, which way I wanted to go. Probably the most valuable thing for me when I was starting to research the hobby was stargazing parties. I did attend a couple of events that were Pima County stargazing events that I know the TAAA was involved with. And I also attended events at Star Arizona. Every month they have a stargazing party, weather permitting, and they have telescopes on display that you can look through. And what I found was a lot of the new customers or customers that had bought recent Astro gear, they would come in and actually try out their gear maybe for the first time and get some help from the folks that work at Star Arizona. That was really helpful to me. I got to talk to people and get an idea of how they were doing imaging. So from all that information, and this was over like a month or so, I put together more of a mental list on the types of things that I wanted to do from an objective standpoint. For one thing, I wanted to do visual and imaging. Although the truth of the matter is I hardly do any visual at all right now. I'm strictly devoted to imaging. I wanted to be able to capture wide field objects or objects that were closer to Earth. And I also wanted to be able to photograph distant objects like distant galaxies that might be 20 million light years away. Light gathering was very, very important. And for those of you who aren't into imaging, it's all about collecting as many photons as you can in the shortest period of time. So that's why having a fast scope or a fast rig is very important from an imaging standpoint. Budget was a big consideration. I wasn't going to spend, $25,000 on a telescope that wasn't in the cards for me. But most importantly was ease of use. I didn't want to be one of those that spent all the money on the gear, brought it home, tried it out, and found out they couldn't use it. It was too difficult to work with. And then they ended up selling it or giving it away. So one of the things I was looking at, I was considering two different configurations. One is a configuration that many of you who do visual may be familiar with, and that's the Celestron Next Star series that uses an alt-azimuth mount. So it can go up or down, left or right. It's an all-in-one unit. It can actually, through selecting stars and guide stars and so forth, you can actually calibrate it so you can look at any distant object in the sky. And that can be modified with a camera with the proper equipment to do imaging as well. And then the other end of the spectrum is the same OTA or optical tube assembly on an equatorial mount, such as the AVX mount shown here. Now, the advantage there is that now I can shoot longer exposures, and an equatorial mount is really the one that you want to go with if you're going to get into imaging from a long-term standpoint. Even though you could image on an alt-az mount, that would kind of restrict you in terms of how long your exposures could be. And in looking at the basic astro imaging components, what you're looking to put together, these are the basic components that any astro rig will have. Everything else is interchangeable. You definitely want to have a mount. That's probably the most important thing that you want to look for. You don't want to buy a cheap mount or a mount that's not capable for doing what you want to do. So my suggestion if you decide to look at this is to get the most expensive mount that you could afford without spending a fortune, but get something that's going to be usable for you for years to come. The optical tube assembly or the telescope, that's a variable. You could start with something such as a a fixed prime lens, such as a Rokinon 135, and hook that up to a mount, and still have it hooked up to an Astro camera, and you could photograph that way. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the setup that I have. That's a variable item as well. Having a smart controller, and there are various ways that I've seen people do this. Some people use their laptops and they're using third-party open source tools such as Nina or SharpCat. I chose to go with an appliance approach, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. A guide scope and a guide camera are nice to have, especially if you want to shoot long exposures, say longer than 30 or 60 seconds. It also helps with other things, which I'm not going to go into today's presentation. It's getting more into the processing side of thing and image quality. But ultimately, you want to get to the point where you have a guide scope or a guide camera. An electric autofocuser is a very nice item to have as part of the rig, mainly because as temperature changes and fluctuates throughout the night, that can affect your optics. So even if you've already set your focus initially before you started imaging, that can change. So that is something that I consider a very effective item to have as part of your rig. A filter drawer or a filter wheel, especially if you're not in a totally dark sky area, you're going to have light pollution to contend with. Or if you're photographing nebulas that have hydrogen and oxygen, you might want to capture that for imaging purposes. And an astro-cooled camera. My first thought when I was looking at this hobby was I could just use my own digital camera and hook it up with an adapter. And yes, you can do that. However, I decided if I was going to do this, I was going to do this within my budget, but I was also going to get the right components so I didn't have any regrets later on. So finally, in December of 2022, I went into Star, Arizona, purchased my rig, which consists of a package which includes the Celestron AVX equatorial mount and my optical tube assembly or my telescope, which is Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope. And I actually found it was cheaper to go with that than it would have been if I went with the Alt-Z configuration and then later added on the EQ mount. It would actually have been more expensive, and that's why I went with this configuration. I did add a Telrad finder scope because the finder scopes that come with the Celestron C series are rather small and they're difficult to work with. Got the filter drawer. I also got what's called the Hyperstar 8, and I'll explain that later. And then the smart component of this whole operation is the ZWO ASI Air Plus. It's a Wi-Fi controller, and it gives me the benefits of a smart telescope. But in this configuration, I have the different components that I can switch in and out. The electronic focuser, as I mentioned before, I started out with the 533 MC Pro camera, which is a great beginner's camera, but I have since gone to the 2600 MC Pro because I wanted to have a wider field of view, especially for larger objects. And I got the Optolong L Pro light pollution filter. I've since changed that out, and I'll explain that later. And the Celestron Dew Shield, not because we have dew here in Arizona, because we really don't. It was mainly so I can take calibration frames when I'm using the Hyperstar. So, of course, what typically happens when you get a new rig and you bring it home, it rains. And it rained, if you recall, December of 22, it rained for about 3 or 4 weeks. So here I am in my house and I'm practicing, because again, I'm totally new to this, setting up the equipment and taking it down without destroying the equipment. And if you decide to go with this configuration, my only advice to you is when you're assembling the mount on top of the tripod, make sure you hold on to the mount before you attach everything to the bottom. Don't ask me why, but I'm telling you, it can save you a lot of grief. If you just hold on to your mount, eventually it'll become second nature to you to put the thing together. So in spite of the fact it was raining, I decided through my research that I better learn how to process Otherwise, I spent all this money on the rig, and it's a modest rig. It's not that expensive. But if I didn't know how to process this stuff when I capture it, then I'm just wasting my time. So I found out about Adam Block. I didn't know who he was initially, but I found my way to his site. I saw him in some of the YouTube videos, and I decided to invest the $60 in a fast track training course for PixInsight. And I got a trial version, a 45-day trial version of PixInsight to go along with it, just to make sure it would work on my computer. And as things would just happen to happen from a coincidence standpoint, my vintage 2012 iMac 27-inch computer decided to have a stroke about the same time that I got the telescope. So my wife and I had to go to the Apple store and buy a brand new iMac, and it worked fine with PixInsight. I didn't have any problems with it. And this was very helpful to me. If you decide to go on with the rest of this courses, that's up to you. But from a foundational standpoint, I wanted to start out with some basic training because I did explore a lot of YouTube lessons that were out there at the time, and they were all over the place. They didn't have the current versions. So if you're looking for a basic foundational course that's up to date, I highly recommend Adam's course. So now let's talk about the gear. This is the Celestron AVX mount. It has 3 knobs on it. The one in the back is used to control the altitude. And then the other knobs on the left and right allow you to move it back and forth. And you'll use that for polar alignment, and I'll explain that later on. This has 2 axes. It's called the deck axis and the RA axis. There is a counterweight on this model. And I will tell you that there are new models out now, and had I known back then about the AM5 mount, I probably would have bought that. That's ZWO's latest strain wave mount. But there are new models out from other manufacturers as well. It's a little more accurate from a guiding perspective, but I will tell you, once you learn how to balance this mount properly, and once you learn how to properly polar align it as accurate as you can, it does a pretty decent job of guiding. You're going to have round stars if you do it right. And this is the optical tube assembly, the Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope. It's a mirrored telescope, and it has a corrector plate. The light comes in through the corrector plate, bounces against the primary mirror, hits the secondary mirror, and then you can view it visually. That's how a typical SCT works. Has a focusing knob and an eyepiece. Its native focal length for this model is 2,032 millimeters, which is quite a lot. It's a pretty slow telescope. It's an f10, and it's an 8-inch diameter scope. Now, I was waffling back and forth between the 6-inch one and the 8-inch one, and I finally decided on the 8-inch one just because of light gathering capabilities. The 8-inch gathers about 85% or 84% more light than the C6. So that was important to me from a long-term perspective. Now, the thing about this scope is it's like a Swiss Army knife. It can do multiple things. So right now, it's set up for visual. If I take out the secondary mirror, if you look on the right picture, you'll see that little retaining ring. That's the secondary mirror. When you loosen that, and when you carefully, and I emphasize carefully, take out the secondary mirror, you can replace it with the Hyperstar. And this was designed and it's manufactured by Arizona specifically for SCT type telescopes. And what this does now, it converts your 2032 millimeter scope to a 390 millimeter focal length. And instead of shooting at a slow aperture of f10, you're shooting at f1.9. Now, I don't know of any refractor out there that will allow you to shoot at f1.9. So it's collecting a lot of data in a short period of time. You can see the filter ring is attached right in front of it in the bottom picture. And then that's my Astro camera in front of it. And you might be wondering, why are those cords going through that plastic gizmo there that's attached to the OTA? Well, that is one of the biggest problems I had when I started this hobby and imaged, was I was getting stars that had these weird spikes on them. and that was due to the cables. And if you're familiar with a Newtonian scope, those Newtonian scopes are famous for those spikes that you get, and a lot of people like those spikes. That's just because of the way that scope is designed. You have a spider vane that's used to keep that corrector plate in place, and you have that little cross pattern, and that provides you with those spikes and stars. The same thing could be done if I arrange the cables at right angles, but I decided not to do that. So with this little device, it clips on. I just route the cables through it. I take a little bit of gaffer's tape and wrap it around it to make sure the cables don't fall off when it's rotating during the night. And I also take a little gaffer's tape and apply it to the camera itself, so I have a nice, neat fit. And I don't have any diffraction spikes anymore. The stars are completely round, which is great. I would not be able to do this hobby if it wasn't for having the ZWO ASI Air. This makes things extremely easy. If you want to polar align, you don't need a polar scope. It does it automatically for you. It does a plate solve, and then you go through the process, and I'll show you that later on. It connects all of my devices, and the only thing I don't have connected from a power standpoint is my mount. It's always recommended to connect your mount to a power source separately, but everything else, my guide camera, my autofocuser, they all connect directly through here. It allows me to do target selection. As you can see the top screen, that's a view of my iPhone. You can actually see what tonight's best objects are. You can see where they're going to appear in the sky with the graph on the right side. And for me, when I'm imaging, I'm always looking for something that starts out low, goes as high as possible, and then goes down so I can image that object as long as I can throughout the night. And once you select the object, it automatically slew to the object for you. You don't have to calibrate stars or anything. It does it for you automatically. And the other thing that's really nice about this is I can set up the imaging sequence. So if I want to focus on one object throughout the night, I want to start imaging, say, at 8 o'clock. I want the exposure to be 2 minutes, and I want it to take 120 frames as an example. It'll go through that process automatically for me. Once I start imaging, it's completely unattended. So I can do that without staying outside with a laptop hooked up to it. It's all done through the Wi-Fi, which is great. The electronic autofocuser, I would not go with an Astro-Imaging rig without it. It's very important to have it. And one thing I would recommend to you, if you decide, let's say you have an SCT telescope already and you want to add the autofocuser, it does come with its own set of brackets. But when you put that on for imaging, you're not going to be able to use it for visual. So if you decide to take the Hyperstar out and replace your secondary mirror again, you're going to have to dismount the entire EAF. It's going to be a chore for you. So what Star Arizona has is what they call a quick switch, something they designed, and they'll install it for you if you want. They installed mine. And this allows me to permanently keep the EAF attached to the back of the scope. And if you notice that little silver screw on the top, when you want to use it for visual, just loosen it, and now you can use the focusing knob in the back like you would any other focusing knob when you're focusing on an object for visual use. So I didn't start auto guiding immediately. I actually started to take images at 30-second intervals with the Hyperstar. I didn't really need to use guiding, and I did that for a reason. I didn't want to take on too much at one time, so I decided to do this in the 3 phases. The first phase was just figure how to use the rig itself, how to capture images, and how to process them. And then once I got through that phase, I decided, okay, now it's time to add a guide scope and a guide camera. So you can see on the top image, that's my setup when I'm using the Hyperstar at 390 millimeter focal length. I have the ASCAR guide scope, and then I have the ZWO 174 guide camera attached to it. It's one of their best guide cameras for guiding purposes. So then I was able to learn how to use guiding. It's very simple and easy to do on the ZWO ASI Air to do that. I've also changed my camera. I've gone to the 2600 MC Pro so I can get a wider field of view. And then you'll see on the bottom right, that's my configuration that I just used for galaxy season. That brings it to about a 1450 millimeter configuration. It did require a reducer because you really don't want to image at the full focal length. It's not the best thing to do. So with the SCT corrector, and that's another Star Arizona designed and manufactured product designed specifically for the SCT, that does a couple of things. It doesn't just do focal reducing, it also flattens the field for you, and it does coma correction. So you don't have purple fringing in your images when you're processing them. One thing I'll say about this particular configuration, this is the thing that I was dreading the most, being able to shoot at a long focal length, because I heard all sorts of horror stories about guiding. So what I ended up getting was the ASCAR OAG. That seemed to have the best fit for my configuration for the SCT. It also has a little focusing knob on there. So the first problem I had when I set this up at night at home, even though Steve spent about an hour or so with me getting everything pre-focused at the store, I still found that my stars were quite blurry. So I used that focusing knob, and that makes such a huge difference. Instead of having to move my camera up and down and up and down to get it to focus, I was able to focus directly with that helical focuser. It took me a minute to correct the problem. And my guiding with this setup is even better than the guiding I have with the ASCAR guiding at 390 millimeter. It does a great job. One thing I will caution you about is if you decide to go cheap on your guide camera, you're going to be miserable. You're not going to be able to find a guide star. So the one thing that I did that really helped me out in this instance is getting the 174 guide camera. It's a little more expensive, but it has a larger sensor. It's more sensitive. And at f7, I've had no issues finding a guide star. Now, let's go back to when I originally started and it stopped raining and I was able to set my rig up at Star Arizona's parking lot. This is the first image I was able to capture. If you could picture my wife and I sitting out in the 45-degree weather in a light polluted area right next to the Circle K gas station in Star Arizona's parking lot, if you've ever been out there, that's where we're imaging from. Much worse than my backyard image setup. And I went there specifically because I needed assistance in case I had a problem, because this is the first time I was using the rig. In fact, the night before this, I tried to set this up on my own and I couldn't get the darn thing to polar align. And if somebody would just told me when you start your mount and it's going through all the defaults on the screen, if I would have just selected quick sync, that would have solved the whole problem and I would have gotten it to work with my ASI Air, and then it would have worked fine. But you know, you live and learn. You learn from your mistakes. So here we are. If you can picture us with our iPad hooked up wirelessly to my ASI Air, this is the image that we're getting as we're doing what's called a live stack. And as you see the image build, you see all the colors. We thought this was fantastic. In fact, I used my iPhone to take a picture of my iPad screen because I was afraid if I touched the iPad, I was going to ruin the whole thing, which was not the case. That would have not affected it. But I took a picture of this, put it on Facebook, shared it with friends and family. Everyone's thinking this thing is fantastic. But when I look at it today, I can see what a terrible image it is. Technically, you look at the stars, they're all bloated. It looks terrible. But this is typically what you get, even with a smart telescope. When you're doing live stacking, you're not really processing this thing. It's just stacking and doing minimal processing as you go along. But the main thing was I was thrilled that we were able to point it to the eastern part of the sky, and I was able to capture this image. Now, here's the thing about processing. You could take an image that would look like this if all you did was live stack. But if you learn how to process properly, here's an example of image that you can get. And you know, it's not my best version of M42. In fact, it's probably the most difficult thing to image as a first-time imager, just because you have that very bright core in the center or what's called the trapezium of the actual nebula itself. But it's quite an improvement. And one of my goals is to really focus on this object this season and really take a lot of time to learn how to process correctly. But you can actually see the difference. And I've come to the conclusion of this hobby that 30% of it is image capture. After a while, when you set everything up, it's going to be just a standard operation procedure for you. The key is to learn how to process. So some of the considerations you need to look at if you decide you're going to be imaging is to look at your location. What's the Bortle class? What's your neighborhood like? I'm in a pretty crowded neighborhood here in Del Webb, but you might be in an open area where you don't have to worry about it. You have to look at viewing obstructions like trees and buildings. And then you have to look at the weather itself. Is it going to be a cloudy night? Are you going to have a lot of wind? If it gets over, say, 7-8 miles per hour, unless you're in an observatory type setup, you're going to have problems with guiding. So you have to look at the wind. Temperature is also a consideration. If you're going to run your air-cooled camera at -10 or -20 and it's 100 degrees out, your fan's going to be going at 100% throughout the whole night. So you probably don't want to do that. And humidity. Of course, we don't get humidity out here. Now, I happen to be in a Bortle floor area. That's really not a bad area to image as opposed to a 7, 8, or a 9. And I know at the CAC Center, we're getting around a 1, sometimes a 1, between a 1 and a 2, depending on the environment, but it's a pretty dark sky. Now, even if you're in a polluted area, and my area is considered to have some light pollution, there are filters that will take care of this. So if you look at my view, this is facing north. And when I didn't realize that the school had its lights on practically the entire night, which is just north of me. It's an elementary school. But they have it on for security purposes. And I was thinking, okay, I'm never going to be able to polar align with this setup. This is going to drive me nuts. I'm not going to be able to get anything done. But I was really surprised when I used a light pollution filter like the one on the left. There's no problem with it. And you're pointing up higher in the sky than the lights are. So the system itself is pretty sensitive to doing polar alignment, but having a light pollution filter really does help. These are the two filters I have right now. I upgraded from the L Pro because I was getting star halos with it. So I decided to go with the Antlia Tri-Band RGB Ultra filter. I love this filter. This is a great filter for light pollution. It's a great filter for broadband images, and it's even a good filter for nebulas as well. But if I'm shooting an emission nebula, I'm using the filter on the right. That's a true narrowband filter. It's called the IDAS NBZ UHS filter. UHS stands for ultra high speed. That's designed to work with my Hyperstar. They have come out with a new model since then, which works with all focal lengths, but that's the one that I got at the time. And that focuses on HA and oxygen. So if you look at these charts, when you look at the Antlia Tri-Band, it's looking at HA03. It's looking at a broad spectrum of wavelengths, whereas the IDAS is focusing strictly on HA and O3. So here are examples of some images that I've taken from my backyard that are broadband targets. These are typically galaxies, star clusters, and some nebulas that are more like reflective nebulas and so forth. So the left is one of my earlier shots of a globular cluster. That's M13. That's with the Hyperstar 8. Now M106 and the Black-Eyed Galaxy are both very, very distant targets. M106 is 22 million light years away. The Black-Eyed Galaxy is 17 million light years away. And that was with my configuration with the image train on the back of the telescope. When we look at nebulas, or narrowband targets, as I call them, these are emission nebulas. And if I'm shooting emission nebulas, I'm typically using my IDAS narrowband filter. And when I process them, I'll typically process them in an HOO palette. Now, there are some people that will say they don't like the HOO palette. They don't like using false colors. They prefer more of a natural color or a traditional color. And that's fine. And I appreciate both. But this is my style of imaging. And when I'm shooting the emission nebulas, I like to bring out the colors. I like to bring out the details. Okay, so before I start on to the next section, are there any questions that any of you have?
And if you're on Zoom, you can go ahead and type them into the chat. Any questions in the room?
We have one question to the back of the room. I think Bernie Singer has a microphone that he could help with that.
How much money did it rig cost?
Wait till you get on the microphone, please. So Bernie,
How much money did the rig cost?
Good question. The original rig that I bought was $5,100. But I've invested in the guide camera and the guide scope and then the OAG and everything else. So it's I always tell my wife, I'm done spending money, we're done with it. And she says, yeah, you told me that before. It's like a rabbit hole. So you keep adding on to it at a certain point. But I think right now, I think I'm at the point where I need to be, and I'll the only upgrade I'll do next will probably be my mount.
any other questions in the room? Okay, no, so are there some questions from Zoom?
So Dave, you can go ahead and just look at the questions on chat if you got it up, or I can read them to you.
Yeah, let me switch over to Zoom. Oops. Why don't you go ahead and read it, because trying to go from my slide presentation to the Zoom is kind of an effort.
Okay. Peter asks, is image rotation a problem? And if so, how do you deal with it?
Good question. When you're tracking with an equatorial mount, and you're using guiding is what makes it very effective, especially if you're doing longer exposures. So the only thing that's going to affect you, and it's taken care of automatically in PixInsight. When the object meets the meridian, the system will do what's called a meridian flip. And basically the whole imaging train, the whole setup will turn around. And then from there, it'll start imaging again once the object crosses the meridian. So what'll happen is when you go through processing in PixInsight, it's going to align everything together for you. So you're not going to notice that at all. Now, if you're using an Alt-Z type of mount and you're shooting, say, at short exposures, then it's going to do a little bit of cropping because of the way it's going to follow the actual object itself. It's a little different type of situation, but yeah. And in terms of the camera itself, I could rotate the camera if I want to, but I usually try to set that up ahead of time. And then when the system is slewing and tracking the object and you're using guiding with guide stars, it's not an issue. Hope I answered the question for you correctly.
Okay, and the other one is from Mike. Could you expand a little more about the ASI Air Plus controller, what it does, etc.?
Actually, that's a good segue into the next section of the presentation because I'm going to take you through that with a few screenshots.
Okay, I don't see anything else on Zoom and nothing else in the room, so you go ahead and press on.
Okay, and you can still see my screen where it says Deep-Sky Astrophotography, correct?
Yes.
Excellent, great. So this second phase of the presentation, and let me just step back for a second. I've seen a lot of presentations on astrophotography from people who have been doing it for a while in terms of photographing stuff. And I wanted to kind of bring back the curtain and show you everything you need to know. So nothing's a surprise, because sometimes it can become intimidating looking at somebody's mount and looking at all the cables and wires they have hanging off the thing. And I really haven't seen a soup to nuts presentation on what to expect. So that's the whole point of this presentation. So from an astrophotography step standpoint, there are two steps or two areas. There's planning and there's image acquisition. So from a planning purpose, what I typically do is I select the object that I want to image that night or that week if I'm doing multiple nights. And I have various ways of doing that. I'm going to show you how I do that. It's very important to look at what phase the moon is because you don't want to image anything and say like a 50% or 85% moon. You get a lot of light pollution that way. You got to look at the weather and you got to look at visibility. And then from an acquisition standpoint, there's the equipment setup, focusing, polar alignment, slew the target, set planet. You can read this as good as I can, but these are the steps that I typically go through. So let's first talk about planning. If you don't have this application on your phone right now, I recommend you get it. It's well worth it. It's called Photo Pills. You can do this for observing. You can do this for photographing the Milky Way if you're doing nightscape photography. That's why I first got it because I had these grandiose thoughts of doing the Milky Way photography stuff, but I decided not to do that. But it's very, very helpful in determining where the moon is at any point in time. It has a calendar and it has a more detailed view, and that's what I use when I'm planning. Another site that is very helpful, and this is a free website, it's called cleardarksky.com. Even if the weather forecast says you're going to have clear skies, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be totally optimum for imaging. So what Clear Skies does for you based on your location, it'll tell you what the cloud cover is going to be at one time of night. It'll talk to you about transparency, seeing, darkness. It breaks it up and has explanations on the website. I'm not an expert on how I use this thing, but I just use it for the basic things that I need to look at when I'm deciding whether I'm going to image that night or not. I mean, there could be some wildfires near you, and that could be causing problem with smoke, which your weather app may not pick up. Stellarium Mobile is another recommendation I have for a mobile app. I use this all the time, and you can use this in a live mode where you point your phone up to the night sky and you can identify objects that way. Or you can use it just by, searching on an object. In this case, it's the Orion Nebula. It tells me where it's going to be in the sky. In this case, you can see it's close to the zenith. It's relatively high. And it gives you a graphic on the bottom, which to me is very important. It tells me, when it's going to rise, how long it's going to be in the sky, and so forth. So that's important from an imaging perspective. So I use that a lot when I'm planning. And the ZWISI Air also has a nice little function called Tonight's Best. You can just go ahead and look up objects that you might be interested in. There have been times where I didn't really plan on doing any specific object for imaging or capturing. So I decided to look at Tonight's Best and scroll through it and then pick an object and go from there. So the steps first to get started is to align your tripod and mount facing north. I use this little app called Astro Locator because, of course, I'm kind of detailed oriented and I like to make sure it's perfectly north. So I'll do that with my mount when I set it up during the day, and I'll set it up. It also tells you, it knows it says 32 degrees. That happens to be my altitude that I need to be set at. So that's a nice way to make sure your mount is set up properly. But usually when you set it up the first time, you shouldn't have to worry about it, just based on your location. And then once I set up the actual mount, and the reason I have this text in this order is this is the correct order to set it up, especially if you're using counterweights. You set up the mount on your tripod first, you add your counterweights, and the last thing you want to add is either your telescope or, in this case, the C8 or optical tube assembly. You want to make sure everything you have a solid foundation before you slide your OTA into the actual mount itself. So now let's talk about the ZWASI Air and how I use this. So Once it gets dark enough, I'll typically do a pre-focus first just to make sure everything's focused. Before I do my polar alignment, I find I get a more accurate polar alignment that way. But if you've done everything right in terms of your initial setup, and you connect everything, and everything's powered on, you'll get this screen after you select PA for polar alignment. And it tells you, set the mount RA axis northward, connect your main camera. It tells you everything you need to know. You hit the little play button there. And then it goes around and it does something called plate solving. It has like a built-in star chart. So it goes around, moves the system a few degrees, takes a few images, and then once it's satisfied that it's calculated where you should be in regards to Polaris, to the final steps of your polar alignment, it'll tell you, let's go. So you hit that button, and it brings up a target. And that center target is where you want to be aligned to. So it'll tell you on the top right there, it'll tell you, look, a little sad face. That means you're not properly polar aligned yet. It'll say that you optimally want to bring your mount down about 0.18 degrees, but you have a big error with your one section where you want to turn left and right. You want to make sure that's properly aligned. One thing I've learned, just to give you a little hint here again, so if you get this set up, you'll know what to do. When the arrow is facing right, you're going to be facing behind the mount. There are two knobs. One's on the right, one's on the left. So it's pointing to the right. You got to move your knob on the right. If it's pointing to the left, you got to move your knob on the left. And then once you refresh it, after you moved your knobs, it'll tell you where you're at and if you're getting closer or not. In this case, it took me about 9 minutes to get myself polar aligned, because I have found that if I can get it below 0.5 error, in this case, it's 0.21, then I'm close enough. Then I'll get some really accurate guiding at that point. It even gamifies it. It'll give you fireworks and stuff. It's kind of entertaining when you first use it. But this is just an idea of how easily polar aligns. You don't need a polar scope like you used to in the old days. It's completely automated. Then the next step is, once I select a target, then it'll slew to the target and set the plan. As you can see, it's showing you, based on the camera you're using, it'll tell you where you're lined up. In this case, it's M104. It doesn't really matter whether this thing is horizontal or vertical. It's small enough in the frame where, that's where the Sombrero Galaxy is at. And it doesn't matter how my camera's rotated, I'll still be able to get a good view of the object itself. You'll set a plan for it. If you see on the bottom right, it says set plan. So when I go into plan mode and set that up, that'll allow me to determine how many exposures I want to take, what's the exposure time, and there's some other options which I'm not going to go into right now, but you can set that up so it can run unattended. And then from here, you go into what's called guiding calibration. So once it's found the object, it's slew to the object and it's tracking it, then I just select calibration. And all I have to do here is I hit the middle button where the little target's at, and it'll automatically find a guide star for me. It'll do its calibration. And once it does its calibration, you're pretty much set for the night at that point. And then it'll show you a graph, so you're ready to start guiding. And that'll show up on your actual display when you start your imaging plan and you get that started. So it's showing me that I'm 0.82, which isn't bad. Anything below 1 is pretty decent. But if I can get like to 0.5 or lower, then I know my guiding is extremely accurate. But I wouldn't fret too much on the numbers when you first start to do guiding yourself. The key here is, as long as your stars are round, you're in good shape. You don't have to worry about it. And you can see on this screen, it shows me my guiding graph. It also shows me I've shot 11 of 200 images, and it's 65 seconds into the exposure. I think I did about 2-minute exposures on this particular object itself. There is also a little histogram on the bottom. And with that, you can adjust it so you can darken it a little bit or lighten lighten it a little bit so you can get a better view of what the image looks like. It doesn't affect what you're shooting. It doesn't affect your exposures. It's just more so you can easily view the object itself. And then let's say you're done with imaging for the night. You got up, it got as many exposures as it could. Before you go inside and start loading the images onto your computer, you want to do what's called a flat frame or a calibration frame. And the way this is set up is there's a option called auto run, and it asks you, do you want to do flat frames or dark frames or what's called bias frames? I usually just do flat frames and dark frames, and that's about it. The way I do it when I'm using it with my image on the back, my imaging on the back of the image trains, you can see here is I just take an undershirt that I have in a little knitting loop thing, and I put my little Amazon tracing pad that I got from Amazon on top of it. I set the brightness control. It has 6 different settings on it. And then I run my calibration frames in an auto mode. And the reason you want flat frames is if there have been any changes to your image train, in this case, it could be from changing a filter, or it could be maybe there's some new dust, more dust that got in your corrector plate. You want to make sure you have clean frames. So the calibration frames, what it does is it'll basically remove any possible dust bunnies that you have on your image, so you have a clean image to work with. Now, if all this is too much and you're saying, I don't want to spend all that money on a Astro rig for imaging, I don't even want to adapt the rig that I have right now, there are some new smart telescopes out there. You might have heard of these already. These were not available to me when I was looking to get into the hobby. And for all I know, if I would have seen this little guy for $500, I would have said, let's start with this first. And I could have very well done that. But I'm glad I didn't. I see this as a smart scope that I can use if I'm on vacation, or if I just want to shoot one night. I know I'm going to only have maybe an hour or so to shoot. I don't want to set the whole rig up. I'll just set this thing up outside and I can image with it. I don't currently have one now, but when they come out with the newest release, I do plan on possibly getting one of these. I could see it. I've seen some really good results with it. The point of this whole thing is this is actually being the actual brains of the C-Star 50 from ZWO is basically taken off of the ZWO ASI Air. So the only difference with this setup versus the setup that I have now is mine is a do-it-yourself setup. You have to assemble everything together. But once you know how to assemble it, it's not a big deal. But in terms of the operation of it, it's basically the same. This is just an all-in-one setup. You turn it on. It does plate saving automatically for you. It doesn't even have to do polar alignment. And you're off to the races and you could start imaging. It's also very good for outreach. So to get people more involved in imaging, this is a great way to start out. Or let's say you have your grandkids, you want to buy them a nice little setup to start imaging with, but you don't want to spend $5,000. This is a great alternative to do that. Let's say you don't have a telescope, but you still want to get into astro-imaging. There's another resource called Telescope Live, and this is something that I use just about every month, especially during the times when I can't image on my own, or if I want to image a object that is not in our hemisphere, like a southern hemisphere object. So Telescope Live is a subscription-based model, but they have about 7 different telescope setups in observatories throughout the world, both in the northern and southern hemisphere. So if you don't want to go ahead and take your rig to Chile or Australia, you can use Telescope Live. The other thing I use Telescope Live with is, besides capturing objects that I can't capture from this hemisphere, is I'm actually learning how to process with mono images now. And this is a great resource to do that with. And here are some of the images that I processed through Telescope Live. The one on the top left is the Dragons of Ara. The one on the bottom left is the Eta Carina Nebula Complex in Southern Hemisphere. The one in the middle is the Vela. It's a supernova remnant, and this is called Vela XYZ. The one on the top right is called Vela SNR. And then the one on the bottom right, I think it's kind of an interesting name for it. It's called the Statue of Liberty Nebula. And that particular image that I processed, I was able to get a top pick nomination from Astrobid, because they have a little contest and they pick the best images and they give you a little star or an arrow or something just as recognition. Any questions before we talk about processing?
It's in the room. Okay, I don't see any hands in the room. Do we have any questions on Zoom?
Nope, I don't see anything on Zoom.
Great. And I know we started a little late and I wanted to keep this to an hour, and I think we should be in good shape for that. My intention with processing is not to show you how I process an image. It's just to give you an idea of what's involved without taking you through a detailed processing session. So let's talk about image processing. Now, as I mentioned before, I use PixInsight. There are other products out there that I could have used. I could have went with Cyril, which is a free processing program. I could have went with AstroPixel Processor, which you have to pay a license fee for, but it's been around for a long time. But I decided to go with PixInsight. Now, why did I go with PixInsight? Well, when I was doing my research, I found out that most of the YouTube videos regarding processing had to do with PixInsight. I found out there was a very large PixInsight community on Facebook where people were doing processing. There are some processes, what they call processes or scripts, that are available on PixInsight you can't get anywhere else. And I just got a feeling that PixInsight was the main processing program that people were going to now. If you were starting out in imaging, PixInsight was the one to go with. It was the most widely used one, as far as I could tell. And I'm glad I did. Some people will tell you, well, PixInsight's hard. I'm not at PixInsight yet. I'm still using XYZ product, and maybe I'll get to PixInsight eventually. They think it's a difficult program. Well, there's a lot of layers to it. There's a lot of things you can do with it, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily a hard program to use as long as you get some basic training on it. And that's why I recommended Adam Block's fast track training as a minimum. But, you know, I decided to go all for it, and I'm involved in all of his products now. So I'm a full member. I take advantage of all of his training because it's there when I need it. And there's a lot more that I need to learn about processing in PixInsight. So for me, if you're going to spend that much money on an Astro rig, no matter what it is, you might as well spend a little bit of money on the software and a little bit of money on the training. The nice thing about the software with PixInsight is it's a one-time fee. There's no annual maintenance fees. You don't have to pay for upgrades. And they probably do major upgrades on this. I think it's like about every 6 months there's a new upgrade for it. But what I really like about PixInsight is the third-party developer community. There is a ton of new scripts and new processes that can automate things for you and make things easier for you when you're processing that cost you virtually nothing. The only thing that I would recommend that you need to buy, and I consider these must-buys besides the PixInsight license fee, is 3 programs from RC Astro. And it's Blur Exterminator, Noise Exterminator, and Star Exterminator. Blur Exterminator is a very widely used product now in PixInsight, and it really does a great job of sharpening your stars, reducing the stars, reducing the halos. It's only been on the scene for a couple of years now, but I can tell you there were other methods you could use, but nothing's as effective as blur exterminator. This can make a night and day difference in your images. Noise exterminator is another new program that you can use that helps reduce the noise. And I can tell you, when you collect all your images and you process them, and you look at them the first time, you're going to look at the image and go, oh my gosh, what am I going to do with this image? Looks terrible. But noise exterminator helps with that. And then star exterminator, I use that because when I'm processing a nebula and I want to focus on just processing the nebula and not affect the colors or the brightness in my stars, I can focus on the nebulas. And what star exterminator does is it just basically removes all the stars from the image. So all you see is the nebulosity. So it's a great tool to work with when you're processing. Now, because I'm a photographer, I also have Lightroom, and I also have Photoshop, and I also have Topaz Denoise. I use these as finishing touches at the end. When I'm done with my initial processing in PixInsight, I'll go ahead and use those tools. But if you don't have those tools and you don't want to pay for the $10 a month subscription for Adobe for them, you can spend $35 on a product called Affinity Photo, and it does just about everything that Photoshop and Lightroom do for 35 bucks. You can't beat it. And typically what I'm using this tool for is just a few items just to do some finishing tweaks that I can't really do effectively in PixInsight. So this is my processing workflow. And, when you look at PixInsight the first time, it's like there's no follow the arrow and do this next and do this second. There's no guideline for it. You really have to take some basic training for it. But after a while, you learn the basic workflow. The first thing is to take all your images and stack them and normalize them and do all the things that are needed to do to give you what's called a master image to work with, or what's called a master light. That is done in what's called WBPP, or weighted batch preprocessing. I'll talk a little bit about that later on. Unless you're in a completely dark sky Bortle 1 area, you're probably going to have some gradients to contend with, whether it's light pollution or whether it's some moonlight that's out there. So there's ways to do that. And that's the second step. Then you might have to calibrate your colors. There's color calibration. After you get done with that, then you can use blur exterminator, noise exterminator. And then you have to take an image from what's called a linear state to a nonlinear state. It took me a while to figure out what the heck did they mean between linear and nonlinear. But basically, if you look at it this way, have you ever seen a histogram that has 256 different levels of light from dark to light? That's basically what a linear state is. You need to get it from that. First, you have to do the basic adjustments, but then before you do anything else after that, you want to bring in what's called a stretch state or a nonlinear state. The way I look at it is when I'm taking images with my camera for my regular photography, I'm shooting in an uncompressed state called RAW, where nothing has been done to the image. I'm not shooting in a compressed format like a JPEG image, for example, that you typically do if you're using your phone or point and shoot camera. And then I'll process it and save it as a TIFF file or a JPEG file or a PNG file, whatever I want to use it for. That's typically the way I look at it. I could be wrong in my description of it, but you start out in a linear state, and then you want to bring it to nonlinear. Very easy to do. Then you go into what's called curves transformation. That's where you can start tweaking your colors, making adjustments, adjusting the lights and the darks and the midtones. Those can all be done in curves. And then finally, if you have either Affinity Photo or Lightroom or Photo, you can use those tools. There are a lot of people that don't have those photographic tools and they don't use them. That's really up to you. Now, when I started using PixInsight, I came in at just the right time, because at that time, they just released a new feature called weighted batch preprocessing. Think of it this way. It's really just a pipeline. Normally, what you would have had to do in the past is go through all the different steps to create what's called a master light or a master image. Now they've automated that process. So all you need to do, and I don't even think about it anymore, you take all of your light frames. These are all individual light frames that I loaded in. So what I do is I take my thumb drive. I've already done my calibration frames. They're all in that thumb drive. I load them up in the separate folders, and then I go into my WBPP screen like this, and I click on the light tabs, and I click on the little plus thing, and then I just look for the folder. Very easy to do so. I copy and paste it directly. Actually, I just go ahead and select them in my folder, and then I'll bring them directly into my lights folder. In this case, I have 115 frames that I took for 2-minute exposures in this case. And that's all you have to do. You do the same thing with your flat frames and your dark frames. And you'll see on the right section here, where it says subframe rating and imaging registration, astronomic solution, local normalization, and image integration. Those are steps you would have normally had to do separately. But in this case, because we have this pipeline, it's going to run it for you automatically. Then really all you have to do at this point is select a folder. As you can see on the bottom right, this was for the Whirlpool Galaxy M51. I selected a folder to find where it's going to go when it's done producing the master light frames. And I just hit run. And then I leave my office and go for a run or grab a cup of coffee, whatever I'm going to do, because it's probably going to take a couple hours to get this done, depending on what speed computer you have. And then you'll come back and you'll see, these are all the steps, by the way. This is all the steps that it goes through. And then it's done. So the image on the left, that's M104, the Sombrero Galaxy. That's what the actual master light looks like after you run all that stuff through WPPP. That's what you're left to work with. But as you can see, when you go through the workflow, this is what you have as an endpoint. And it's probably not the best 104 picture I've seen. I mean, I'm sure I can work on it more. This is the first time I actually captured this. But this particular object was one of my bucket list items for capturing deep space objects. And this was one of the ones I wanted to produce. Another example is the Horsehead Nebula. That's relatively close to us. It's only about 1,500 light years away. This was captured with the Hyperstar configuration. And you can see the way the camera is set up with the Hyperstar, it kind of turns things upside down. So this is what the master light looks like on the left. But as you can see with the processing I did, and I actually redid this processing on this image, on this object a couple weeks ago, see all the detail you can get in this that you couldn't see in the master light. The point is that the detail of the image, the colors you're trying to bring out, they're all in that master light. It's just a matter of bringing it out through processing. And finally, this is the end of the presentation. I wanted to provide you with some resources to start out with if you decide you wanted to get involved with imaging. First, I want to talk about the ASIG group I belong to, which stands for the Astro-Imaging Special Interest Group. That's headed up by Greg Ruppel. I joined the ASIG group about a month after I joined the TAA. Just happened to be, I was looking around and I found out about this ASIG group and I was wondering what it was, and I joined the group. They have meetings every month, and it's just a way for the astro imagers and TAA to get together, share ideas, do little internal presentations. And we now have a beginner's corner. So if you're just starting out and you have questions, the first half hour of the hour-long meeting is devoted for beginners. So you can have a bunch of geeks like me helping answer some of your questions. Anablock Studios, I highly recommend it, at least for taking the first fast track training course. To me, it gets you off on the right footing, gets you out into a solid start. So at least you have a basic workflow to work from. And I will tell you that on YouTube now, all these different YouTube channels I have listed, I listed these specifically because these are the people that I trust to give you the correct information. There are other YouTubers out there, which I would not recommend, that don't necessarily give you the best advice for processing or gear you should use and so forth. But I would recommend these. Astro Backyard, this guy's based in Canada. This is his full-time job for a living. He runs a YouTube channel and he has a blog and he has a thing you can pay for if you want to join it for advice. But you know, basically, this is his full-time job. Him and his wife do a great job here. And he has some great videos for first-time imagers that you can follow. It's all in his YouTube channel. I learned how to use the ASI Air for the most part through Peter Zelinka. He has several different videos on how to use the ASI Air. Another Astro channel is from Bill Blanchard. He's one of those developers that developed some processes and scripts, which I use all the time. And I cannot do the type of processing I wanted to. I probably could if I wanted to, but it makes it a lot easier when I'm processing narrowband images and I want to create either an HOO image or that SHO Hubble palette type look. I use his process that he developed, and that just makes things so much easier to do so. In fact, Adam Block now has a fast track training class for narrowband imaging, and he uses Bill Blanchard's process to do that. There's another guy called Easy Astro Images. If you just want to get a quick astro fix, he has videos on how to do things. And by his title, he likes to do things the easy way. Sean Nielsen from Visible Dark is well known in the YouTube community. Luco Manico is Luke Newbold from the UK. This is the guy that showed me the workflow to how to process a narrowband image properly the first time when I was first getting involved. So he was very helpful. View into Space, Sasha Weiss is from Switzerland. He actually has a new course on YouTube, start to finish, on how to get started in astrophotography. It's just been, he hasn't got all the videos out yet, but he just started that. And he has a lot of good advice as well. I've learned a lot through him. And then there's this new guy, his name is Frank, I forgot his last name. It's called SETI Astro. He seems to come out with a new script just about every week or a new process. And I don't necessarily like all of his processes, but there are some that I'm using now that I'm really starting to like. But he's a new person on the block, but he's producing a lot of free scripts and processes that you can use within PixInsight. So Astrobin, another thing I want to recommend, go through astrobin.com, look up images that are out there. If you have an idea for the type of rig you want to put together, if you decide to get into Astro-Imaging, look up your equipment and you'll see a bunch of images. It's a great resource to look at. And I'm all done. Any questions?
I have a question in the room. So Bernie, can you bring your... Okay, here we go.
Yes, this is Paul Lorenz. I, of course, have taken a number of images too from. I understand you're in Vail. You may be near right where I'm at. Just out of, if you don't mind my asking, are you in
Yeah.
Rancho del Lago?
Yeah, I think we discussed this before once at one of the ASIG meetings. But
Oh.
yeah, Paul, yeah, I live in the Del Webb community at Rancho del Lago.
Uh-huh. I might be within walking distance of you.
I wouldn't say walking distance, but you're a quick drive, about a 5-minute drive.
Well, okay. Also, one other thing, have you ever used spectroscopic photometric color calibration, SPCC for short?
Yes, I use that all the time when I'm doing a broadband image. That's one of the things that Adam Block teaches you in his fast track training course. He has you set up all the catalogs and walks you through that process. And I use SPC all the time, except when I'm using narrowband data like HA or O3 data or SHO data, which has sulfur in it. I do not use SPC for that. You don't want to use it on narrowband data, but for broadband data, for reflection nebulas, yeah, I use SPCC all the time.
Because so do I. And I find it to be very reliable. It really
Yeah.
gives on nebulas. what kind of, when you do narrowband, do you take a color at a time? Do you have, oh, that's right, you have a filter that just filters out those certain wavelengths, but you can do them all in one.
Well, yeah, actually, I've had the IDAS NVZ filter for a while. I love that filter. It's a great filter to use for narrowband objects, but it only isolates the hydrogen and the oxygen channel. However, and as soon as the weather clears and it's not real windy here in Vail, I'll be able to shoot something. I'll be able to use my new filter. It's a ASCAR Color Magic D2 filter. And that isolates the O3 and the S2 or the sulfur nebulous or narrowband wavelengths. Now, with that, it's going to be a big test to determine whether I ever go mono in the future. Because with mono, of course, you need a separate set of filters for RGB, a separate set of filters for SHO, if you're going to use that for a nebula target or an emission target. And there's a lot of time that goes into it as well as the expense of it. But with the second filter, I'll be able to have SHO data to work with a one-shot color camera. And there's a new script now, perfect timing, called DB Extract, where you can actually split off the 3 different channels from the 2 different master images that you'll create using those 2 sets of filters. And I've already tested it with my dual narrowband filter, and it works fine. So I'm looking forward to checking that out and seeing if I can get a true SHO image, you know, with those two sets of filters.
Oh, okay. All right, thanks.
No problem.
Any other questions in the room? Okay, we have Bernie. Oh,
One more,
all right.
One more.
We have 2 more. Okay.
What
So
kind of
thank you,
cost-
Bernie.
What kind of cost do you have invested in the basic software?
Oh, good question. Yeah, so with PixInsight is for US based dollars, pretty sure it was around a little over $300. I think it was like around $325 US dollars. And then I bought the complete set from Russell Cronin, which is RC Astro. That's Blur Exterminator, Noise Exterminator, and Star Exterminator. And I'm not sure exactly what the total cost was, but I think it was under $200 for all 3 of those. He does have a package you can get. What I do is I bought each one at a time, and then I kind of credit it. He credits a portion of it towards the other licenses. And again, it's a one-time fee that you're paying for those. So figure, you know, $500 to $600 total for software costs. But once you get it, you're done at that point.
Okay, Bernie, we have a question from Angela in the red top.
No, I'll come down.
First of all, I have to tell you, this is over my head, like totally over my head, but thank you so much for mentioning that your wife was the one who encouraged you to buy a telescope. So this is
Yeah.
my question. I guess there's 9 women here. Thank you, everybody. We meet once a month. We have our own women's gathering. You know, people interested in astronomy. So I wanted to say that you mentioned a lot about he, all these people. So are there any women that you know that are in this same thing that you do? The real technical part with the buying and the learning and all these. things that
Are you
mentioned.
talking about here in Tucson, or are you talking on YouTube, or what are you talking
No,
about?
everything that you mentioned, and you gave all these lists, you said he. So I'm wondering, we need more women to learn the technical stuff, and I want to learn. So it's wondering.
I should have probably listed her site. There is a lady, Sarah Matthews, I think her name is. She is very well versed in the whole field of astrophotography, and she can get really technical too. She's on YouTube as well. There's another person that I've seen occasionally, and I forgot her name. But yeah, there are women out there that do astrophotography. It's open to everybody. But from what I've seen, at least from the YouTube experts out there, I think there are maybe two women that I've seen that have regular YouTube channels.
The students now that are on campus, a lot of them are women and they're going into all the sciences because of
Yeah.
that new program, science and math.
Right.
So I'm grateful. I'm grateful you mentioned your wife and getting the telescope.
And
Women
I
are
just
starting
want to
to get
just want to
into it better.
emphasize again, when I got into this hobby, I had no intention of getting into it in the first place. I had no intention of getting involved or buying a telescope or anything like that. I was just going to continue my regular photography, which I still enjoy. Um, but if I can do it, anybody can do it. You don't need to be an astronomer or an astrophysicist to learn this hobby. Although a lot of astronomers and astrophysicists do this. Brian May, who you may be familiar with, if you like the rock group Queen, Brian May was the founding member of the rock group and is also the lead guitarist for it. But he also has a doctorate in astrophysics, and he's still active in it. But he had a saying, he said, astronomy is more fun if you're not an astronomer. And I was going to put that quote in initially, but I didn't want to upset the astronomers in the group. And I think that's true. So, this is something you have to be patient with. It's a hobby that takes a little bit of a commitment to learn it. And yes, my wife did give me the go-ahead to get in started with this, but then I looked at the cost and what I was spending, which is still kind of a modest setup. And I figure if I don't learn how to do this right and I can't produce images, I'm never going to hear the end of it. So that's why I spent the time and the effort to learn how to do what I'm doing so far. And I'm still learning.
Any other questions in the room? So do we have questions on Zoom?
So a couple on Zoom. Mike asks, are the RC Astro programs you just described also built into PixInsight? Or are the RC programs truly separate and not built into PixInsight?
Yes, there are. So there are base processes. There's probably a few hundred processes that are part of the base PixInsight application itself. But then there are scripts, and then they're also built in the PixInsight, and then there are also third parties that you can install. So basically, what's involved is when you go into PixInsight, there's a resources tab, and what you'll do is like for RC Astro, there's a link he has that you insert or add into the resources tab area. And then you do check for updates. And then it'll ask you if you want to do it and install the updates. And then you have to restart PixInsight. And now it becomes a part of your processes. So yes, that's how these typically work. Same thing with scripts. Processes are a little bit more advanced. Many of the processes have real-time previews. So that's something's a little different with some of these processes, whereas the scripts typically don't. But in either case, when you install something like this, like RC Astro, he'll direct you to a link that you'll click on, and you'll copy and paste that to the resources tab area, and then it'll just install it for you automatically. And then after that, when there's a new update to it, it'll update it for you automatically as well.
Any other questions on Zoom?
And then one final one is from Dave. Computing power, Apple MacBook Pro, okay to use, or stick to my iMac?
Well, I have an iMac. When I had my iMac 2012, iMac 27 Retina computer, which I loved a lot, it decided to have a little conniption before I started to use my telescope. So I had no choice. I had to buy a new one. I'm actually on an iMac M1 right now. And the only thing that I did was I made sure I got the maximum memory on this, because once you order it, that's it. There's no upgrades beyond it for the CPU memory. And then everything else, I have external drives that I use, but PixInsight works fine. The only thing is your file size. So the larger your file size of your camera, the more time it's going to take the process. But, typically when I'm running the batch processing, I know it's going to take an hour or two, depending on how many shots I have to process. But then actually using the product itself, as long as you're not using exorbitant size files, you should be okay. Most of us cannot afford the cameras that are used to create those exorbitant size files.
Okay, that's all the questions, I think. Thank you, David, so much for coming and for being with us tonight. We really appreciate that, and we hope you see you again soon.
Thank you. It's
And-
my pleasure.
And we are going to have a second presentation tonight. Before we get to that, just in the interim here, I want to thank our technology people. Tonight we have Jim Knoll and Terry Lappin that are doing our technology for us. And Susan Knoll is operating our camera in our room. And we started a new thing now we've got an additional microphone or two that we didn't used to have. So we're going to have a person in the back with a microphone to handle questions as we did tonight. And Bernie Stinger was gracious enough to serve in that capacity tonight. So we want to thank everyone who's been facilitating our technology working so well tonight. And we are now ready to move to our next speaker as soon as we can get this set up. And our second speaker is Ed Foley. And Ed Foley is going to be talking about and giving an update on our important 32-inch project for TAAA. So Ed, I think you're getting set up here.
Many of you may remember. Okay. That sounds better to you? All right. I'm Ed Foley, Vice President at TAAA. Many of you may remember that I was here just about a year ago to tell you about an extraordinary gift that TAAA received, a telescope that yeah. Okay. A telescope that we received and picked up in Colorado, brought down here to Arizona. It is an extraordinary telescope. Just to remind you, it's a DFM. It is a professional telescope. It's a Cassegrain, research grade Cassegrain. DFM scopes are all over the world, primarily at universities. There's one at Kitt Peak. There's one at Whipple. It is a telescope that we received from a defense contractor. They had bought it for a contract for the Air Force that they didn't end up getting. They spent $385,000 for that telescope and had no use for it. They were moving and they called us. So we were fortunate enough to receive that and brought that down to Arizona. It is currently in storage, but you may remember it is a telescope that is very unusual for an amateur club to have. However, it is an instrument that we're confident that we're going to be able to put to work. Members will be able to utilize it, and we'll be able to use it perhaps in research with some of the partners that we've got around Arizona. We've even had a professor from Northern Arizona come down, talk about research that he may be able to do in conjunction with that telescope and groups that we're going to host, school groups that we'd host, all kinds of very interesting things we might be able to do in addition to our members just observing and photographing. The telescope will go to CAC, And if you look at this overview of CAC, I'll zoom in. And there to the right of those two buildings in the middle, it will go right where those little squares are. So it'll be a part of our portfolio of telescopes there at CAC, available to members. It's currently been in storage now for a year. The observatory design has been completed. We have a team that's been working on this now for most of the year. It's a very large telescope and has required some very special features that are beyond what the roll-off roofs that we've had previously out at CAC require. This is, when it is parked, it's 9 feet tall. So it's required more roof, it's required more space. Very, very impressive when you're standing next to it. We've completed the plans, all the shop drawings, and those now have been given to contractors, and we've received bids. And those contractor bids will be taken to the board next week, and we will be asking the board for approval to move forward with the construction of the observatory for the scope. Having said that, it is important to pay attention to the budget. This free gift requires a lot of resources for us to be able to put it into service. And here's a list of all of the different types of expenses that we have in conjunction with the telescope, getting it here, getting the design done, building the observatory itself, and then installing a telescope and getting it commissioned are all significant tasks. The total project is going to cost, we estimate, in the neighborhood of $175,000. We have, as you know, in the past, some very generous members. We have raised and we have cash in the bank of $101,000. We have pledges now that we'll collect here over the next few months of another $40,000. So we are approaching full funding. We have, we think, enough funds to move forward with the construction. We still need some donations in order to be confident that we're going to be able to actually bring the telescope to the site and install the telescope and get the thing commissioned. So I would ask those of you who are able to and are feeling generous to help us to close that final gap. We've got still about 19% of our total funding to go. And it is, it'd be about, I'd say, 4 to 6 months before the building is complete. And at that point, we'll be trying to bring the telescope to the site and go through the process to get it installed. There's still recognition that we be having available for donors at this point. And if you would like to give, the easiest way is to pick up a flyer in the back of the room. There is a sheet describing the project and a sheet that you could fill out that would describe what your pledge is going to be and the various ways that you would be able to give. Here's a complete list. We accept cash. We accept checks. We accept credit cards. We accept donations of securities. We've gotten all kinds of ways in which members have brought funds to the project, and we're very grateful for the 29 members who have given already. It's quite extraordinary that this organization has got the funding to do the things we've done and the expertise to do the things we've done. The team that we've assembled to design and bring this telescope to that site is an extraordinary team with engineering and construction and machining and all types of experience that you just don't find in the normal amateur astronomy group. So if you're feeling generous, please help us close that gap. And we thank all those who have donated to date. We are just about there. Any questions about the project? We have a question here up in front.
To come up with, tell us the microphone, please.
And storage, and they said that, it's air conditioned. So the reason why I'm asking this is because it costs a lot of money for air conditioning.
Your question is about air conditioning?
Yeah, but because we have to pay for that too, to keep the telescope in that observatory. It wasn't on there, that's all I'm saying. We have to pay for that.
I didn't get the beginning of your question.
We build this, when we build the observatory, we're already doing it. We have the manpower, we're getting donations. But does that include all the costs of the air conditioning that we need? Because it's not just in some shack.
Well,
Talking about the upfront air conditioning or the long-term cost of air conditioning?
well, this will be our 6th roll-off roof observatory out there. We've got quite a few of them, and they're all air conditioned by rolling the roof off. No air conditioning required in these, fortunately. It requires a lot of concrete, and this one in particular is 2 tons. So you can imagine that it's, there's a lot of expense in putting foundation in. But when you're observing in these, there's no temperature controls. You want the telescope to be open to the ambient environment. But that number includes all of the costs that we think will be associated with turning the switch on to observe some night.
Other questions? I don't see any in the room. Do we have some on Zoom? No, none on Zoom.
Okay, well, 6 months, first light. Thank you much.
Thank you, Ed, so much for all the work on this project, you and other people that are working on this project. It takes a lot of care and an effort to figure out something as complicated as this and come up with the right kinds of plans, and then to be able to follow through on those plans. So we really appreciate that. I needed to announce here that we do not have a planet report tonight. Some of you may recall that last month, our planet coordinator, Dr. Kurkashka, gave a report for 2 months indicating that he wasn't going to be here this month. So if you want the planet report for this month, you need to just go to the website and it will be there. So, and then I assume that we have an announcement about after the meeting. Terry? Pardon? Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Yes, we do want to do another thing here that I was forgetting. And that is, as you know, Dean Kettleson received 2 awards from the National Park Service. One of these awards is the regional award as Volunteer of the Year. And then one of those awards, which is the one that has been shown right now on the screen, is the National Award for the Park Service Volunteer of the Year throughout the entire National Park Service. Pardon? Yeah, yes, there's only one national award given each year, and then there's only one award given for our region each year. And Dean received both of those this year, and appreciation for all of his work in founding the Grand Canyon Star Party and helping it to become successful. So these are items that that TAAA has been given to keep by the National Park Service since Dean was representing TAAA and his work with the National Park Service. We are planning on trying to get both of them at CAC. And of course, one of them we can hang pretty easily. And then the other one in the box, we've kind of got to figure out, how we're going to locate that or where we might be going to locate that, but we'll be working on that. So if anybody has a thought about that, then let me know. Okay. So, Terry. Pardon?
Dean's family also got some duplicates of these, right?
Dean's family got a copy of the national award, which is the one that's in the box here. And we offered them the plaque for the regional award if they would like to have that. And the family told us that no, they would prefer that it go in TAAA in a visible place where it could be seen and appreciated by other TAAA members, and where other people would also think about volunteering to serve astronomy by having events, and would want to continue the Grand Canyon Star Party. So they felt that the award would inspire TAAA volunteers in a way that they really appreciated. So they gave us this, the regional award that there was only one copy of. And then our ranger, Raider Lane, made a very special request to the Park Service. They usually only for the national award only ever make one of these. And he made a special request to the National Park Service that he wanted 2 copies made and one to be given to the family. So when the award was given in DC recently, a copy was given to the family. So they have a copy and we have a copy as well. So, but thank you, Terry. That's an important thing to share.